This week we're going to be taking a look at sculpture and installation. Now up to this point we've been looking primarily at two-dimensional art. That would be art that is flat. Okay? So with three-dimensional art we bring in a whole new element, which is how the work of art sculpts the space that it is in. So we consider the negative space. We consider how the air is formed by the shapes of the sculpture. Now what we're looking at here is sculptures by the artist Deborah Butterfield. And she first became known by taking driftwood and creating these horses lounging about. As she got more famous, she has actually cast these sculptures in bronze that originated from driftwood. Now the first sculpture in your textbook is by Louise Bourgeois. And let's look at a version of that. This is called Maman. Now, that means mama. It's kind of interesting to have a big scary spider. To me it looks a little bit sinister. And there is that bit about spiders eating their mate and such. But there's probably another element too with the meaning behind this sculpture, in that the artist's mother was, she repaired tapestry. So in some ways she weaved webs. So she was a weaver in her life, much as a spider would weave a web. Now one thing to look at about this one is that it's in the round, meaning that you can walk around all sides of the sculpture. So that's one kind of sculpture that we'll look at, is sculpture in the round. So it's freestanding, all sides are visible. Now another kind is what we call relief sculpture, and this is it's an ancient Mayan piece. There's another Mayan piece in your book, but I thought this one was quite beautiful. This particular piece is a relatively low relief, or bas relief. And a low relief, another example of that would be a penny or a coin. They're slightly indented, but they're not carved that deeply. On the other hand, let's look at an example from India that's a high relief. Oh no, this one is from China actually. This one is from about 200 BC in China. But it's got a little bit more sculpture happening, a little bit more depth to the carving, yet it's still basically a relief sculpture because it is not in the round. There's four basic methods of sculpting that we're going to be talking about here: modeling, assembling, carving, and casting. And let's just take a little look at each one of them. What you're looking at here is modeling. Now modeling is an additive way of sculpting. In other words, you add, you subtract, you squish, you shape. I mean, everybody has probably played with Play-Doh at some point in their lives. So that's what we have here. This particular artist is the artist named Beth Stichter, and I found her on the internet and found she was very interesting. I find it to be very interesting art. Now I want you to notice the cinder blocks and all the kind of plumbing pipes that are holding this sculpture up. That's necessary. It's called an armature, and often it's actually built out of plumbing parts, and the sculpture is built upon that in clay, and then it's either cast in bronze or it might be fired. And when it's fired, once it's dry, these supports will be removed. I just want to show you one more work by this artist. I thought it was pretty interesting. She's got a nice style, in my opinion. And these are large-scale works in clay, which is pretty hard to manage. Now speaking of large-scale works in clay, let's talk about the Terracotta Warriors. This is part of a fascinating collection of sculptures in China that were buried for, I don't know, 1,500 years, at least, more than that. These are life-size. Well, they're about 5 feet tall, so they're life-size for their time period. They were created in about 200 BC. But you know how many there are? 8,000 of these guys in this massive clay army. And they also have, let's see, they have 150 chariots, 500 and something horses to pull the chariots, and then another couple of hundred horses that are just horses to fight in the army. If you think about, these had to be sculpted, hollowed, and fired, this is a miraculous collection of art, I must say. Let's look a little bit at the process and how it works. This one is actually a high school girl sculpting, and notice again the armature. You see this place down here? This is definitely plumbing parts. I've done this myself. Now, one of the things to consider when working with clay is that if it is more than an inch thick, it will explode in the kiln. And even if it's less than an inch thick, if there's an air bubble, there's all sorts of factors that can affect its life in the kiln, whether it makes it through the firing or not. So there's a couple of different methods to make the inside of a sculpture such as this hollow. One that I've done a lot is it's called internal reinforcements, and you sort of make these supports out of clay to hold it up as you build around it. Part of the art of working with clay that's so fun is that you have to really monitor the drying of the clay. First it's wet and squishy, and then you can do a lot of sculpting. But then as it gets what they call leather hard, it can actually support itself more. But you don't want it to dry all the way, because then you can't work on it. And what you can do is keep spraying it once it's leather hard and covering it with plastic, and you could really work on a sculpture for months by keeping it just wet enough to sculpt. Now, another way to get the clay out for firing is to literally cut the thing in half. And this artist is doing that, and then they'll hollow out the extra clay at the core and leave just the 1 inch around the outside. And this is pretty tricky. You have to wait till the clay is hard enough or else it will collapse. But anytime you see a fired clay sculpture like the Terracotta Warriors, there had to have been some technique to hollow it out. Alright, the next thing we're going to talk about is going to be what we call casting. So first, with modeling, it's very direct. You take the stuff, you squish it around, you make a shape, voila, you have it. Casting is much less direct. The most common kind is what we call lost wax casting. And I'd like you all to look in your textbook. Here, let me find the page number for you. I want you all to look at the lost wax process as it's laid out on page 243 in your textbook. So with lost wax, basically you make a core of clay, and then you put a thin layer of wax over it, and you sculpt the wax. And then it's kind of a complicated process of pouring a shell around the sculpted wax, melting the wax out, and then replacing that where the wax was with bronze or some other kind of molten metal. So typically an artist will sculpt a piece in clay or plaster or wax, and then they will have it cast at a foundry. This is a picture of a foundry in China where the artisan is sculpting works by an American artist. That's kind of an interesting development. I have been to foundries, and it's a really wonderful place to visit. So it's interesting that now it would be done in China, but there you go. All right, let's look at a little bit more cast sculpture. Here's a bronze from Africa, and if you look in the textbook on 243, it's really based on an African style of lost wax casting. The African tradition is very rich in its sculptures of the human form. Now they're a little bit more stylized than we see in the European tradition, but no less beautiful. They're very beautiful and they're very symbolic. So here's what we have. Let's see what this guy's name is. This is a water buffalo, and it is sculpted by, I can't find his name, Paul Tadlock. There we go. I just think that's a great sculpture. What I like about it is that he took the nature of this animal and he kind of exaggerated it just enough to give it a certain quality. Now other things can be used for casting too, like ice. This is some guy who's getting, let me see, he's actually trying to sell his ice sculptures. There's quite a lot of ice sculpting online, but it's not all cast. Sometimes it's carved. So this sculpture will become this, which maybe you've seen at parties. Ice sculpture has become kind of the rage now at weddings and big parties and such. So really, you can cast anything that'll be cast, including resin. Now there's this guy named Dwayne Hanson, and he was active in the 1970s. He did such a wonderful job of sort of making fun of the human condition. And here, I think this one would be called the Sunbather. And yes, it is cast in resin, even though it looks like a human being laying out in a museum. He would actually make a cast from a person and then create a resin copy of that person and then sort of dress them up. And he did have a great sense of humor. He loved to poke fun at the human condition. You can look up his tourists. He's done a lot about tourism, kind of making fun of the tourist, and etc. You might want to enjoy looking up Dwayne Hanson, Hansen, online. Here he is at work on one of his sculptures. Now I know it looks like he's just painting on some woman, but it's actually a resin cast sculpture. So on a lighter note, here's his kids. Now if you were walking through the museum and you saw those kids, you might think, what? But there they are. So that's kind of sums up casting, which is a little bit more of a complicated process than modeling. And let's move on and talk about carving. Now carving is what we call a subtractive process. In other words, you take stuff away, right? Whereas in modeling might be an additive process. In modeling you do both, but primarily you add stuff to your clay. Well, in carving you take it away. Now this is a beautiful piece from the Renaissance by Donatello, and it's called The Penitent Magdalen. In this story, Mary Magdalene has been in the desert for 42 years, and she comes out with a great spiritual light about her, as they say, clothed only in her hair, and she's become this kind of a very spiritual figure. So what's spectacular about this piece is that it is the first known wooden sculpture in the round. So up to this time, a wooden sculpture would be attached to something like a tree, or it would have some wooden hunk behind it so that it wouldn't crack and fall apart. But what Donatello did was he hollowed her out all the way up so that she can withstand the fluctuations of temperature, and this wooden sculpture has survived from 1450 to this day. That's amazing in my book. So Donatello, by the way, was one of the most innovative sculptures of the Renaissance. Hey, as long as we're in the Renaissance, let's stay there for a little minute, and I'll show you one of my favorite pieces of all time. Again, this is a carved sculpture, but it's by a different artist, which would be Michelangelo. And what he did here was he's carved marble. Now, if you think about that, look at the folds of the cloth. Marble? Really? Well, another spectacular thing, many spectacular things about this particular work. One of them was that he was a young man in his 20s when he did it. But also it's called the Pietà. And Pietà just means Mary holding the dead Christ. But look at this, study this carefully. See how much bigger Mary is than the Jesus figure? So if they stood up next to each other, the Christ would come up like below her shoulder. But by doing this, he has made the universal image of a mother enfolding her son all the more moving. Also, if you were to look at this closely, if we could zero in, he's done an incredible job of having her fingers, the way that Mary's holding the Christ figure under the arm, it really looks like dead flesh. It's really a very powerful piece. And if you remember like a couple of pieces from art history, hey, Michelangelo's Pietà is a good one to remember. Let's look at one more in this sculpture, in our carving part of life. This is an Olmec Head, and this is from Mexico. And this photograph is from when this head was discovered in 1947. There's another picture of an Olmec Head in your book, but these were carved out of a softer sandstone by the ancient Indians. We don't exactly know why, but it's pretty amazing. Personally, I really like the stylization that they used to create these. All right, so that ends part 1 of the lecture on sculpture. Stick around, tune in, because part 2 is coming, and it is, as they say, bigger and better. But it'll never be more than 15 minutes long. Thanks for listening.